The spoon trembled in Unteroffizier Karl Hoffmann's weathered hand as he lifted it toward his mouth, carrying with it fresh milk, real milk, not the chalky powdered substitute that had sustained the Afrika Corps since 1941. The sweet cream coating his tongue contradicted every word the Wehrmacht had drilled into him about American resources and capabilities. Later that evening, in his hidden journal concealed beneath his prison camp mattress, he would scratch out words that could have earned him severe punishment from Nazi officers in his own barracks. The Americans feed their prisoners better than Germany feeds its own soldiers. It was June 4, 1943, in Mexia, Texas, and through the mess hall windows of the newly opened camp 4 miles west of town, Hoffmann could observe American guards casually consuming thick meat sandwiches during their breaks. His mind drifted back to the Afrika Corps, where his unit had survived on meager daily iron rations of 300 grams of canned meat and 125 grams of hard bread, supplemented only when fortune smiled upon them with captured British supplies. Yet here, in what Nazi propaganda had consistently portrayed as a nation weakened by Jewish influence and democratic softness, food appeared to flow without limit or concern. That morning, 1,850 veterans of Field Marshal Erwin Rommel's legendary Afrika Corps filed into what they expected might be another makeshift feeding station. Instead of the familiar field kitchen with its 2-horse ghoulish Canona wagon serving watery soup, instead of the sand-contaminated rations that had defined their North African campaign, they encountered a fully equipped dining facility featuring electric refrigerators, steam tables, and industrial dishwashers. Each cluster of 5 barracks boasted its own mess hall, complete with trained cooks, waiters, proper silverware, and, by all accounts, exceptionally good food. The entire town of Mexia had turned out to witness their arrival, staring curiously at the tanned, healthy enemy soldiers who marched down Railroad Street under guard. What none of these observers knew was that the breakfast about to be served would trigger what historians would later recognize as the most profound psychological shock in modern prisoner of war history: the systematic demolition of Nazi racial theory through the simple, everyday act of eating. The mathematics of American agricultural production were being demonstrated not through propaganda leaflets or political speeches, but on metal trays loaded generously with scrambled eggs, crispy bacon, white bread, real butter, jam, and genuine coffee. The worldview that had sustained these soldiers through years of desert warfare would crumble not solely through military defeat, but through daily confrontation with what seemed like impossible plenty. The journey to this transformative moment had begun weeks earlier, on May 13, 1943, in Tunisia. General Jürgen von Arnim, Rommel's replacement after the Desert Fox had been recalled to Germany, surrendered along with approximately 275,000 German and Italian soldiers. The Afrika Corps, which had driven the British forces back to the very gates of Cairo and earned the grudging professional respect of Montgomery himself, found itself suddenly and completely captive. Among these prisoners was Obergefreiter Franz Müller, holder of the Iron Cross Second Class, a veteran of both the Poland and France campaigns, and a survivor of 2 grueling years in the North African desert. His detailed account, discovered decades later in the National Archives, would provide historians with the most comprehensive description of what became known as German soldiers' food shock in American captivity. We had been surviving on daily rations of 750 grams of bread, 150 grams of fat, and 120 grams of sausage or tinned fish when supplies actually reached us, Muller wrote in his careful script. More often, we survived on dates scavenged from oases, captured rations when available, or nothing at all. The journey from military defeat to psychological revelation began in the collection cages at Tunis, where Muller and 30,000 other prisoners waited in makeshift camps for transport ships to carry them to an uncertain future. Even during this initial processing phase, American logistics capabilities began systematically shattering the prisoners' preconceptions about their captors. The United States Army processed thousands of prisoners daily with an organizational precision that exceeded anything the Wehrmacht had achieved even at the height of its power and efficiency. But it was the food that delivered the first devastating psychological blow to Nazi ideology. Feldwebel Hans Klein, captured with the 15th Panzer Division, would later write to his wife 6 months into his captivity from Camp McCain in Mississippi, "In the cages at Tunis, While we waited for ships, the Americans gave us white bread with our meals. White bread. In Africa, we had been eating nakebret, a hard, crisp, whole wheat cracker, and only when we were fortunate enough to have any bread at all. The American guards consumed more bread at each single meal than my entire squad had seen in a week of fighting. The Liberty ships that would carry these prisoners across the Atlantic were themselves monuments to American logistical capability and industrial capacity. These vessels, produced at the staggering rate of 3 per day during peak production, were returning from delivering supplies to the European theater. Rather than the cattle cars or cramped transport ships they had expected, the prisoners found themselves in ship holds that had been specifically modified for human transport, complete with proper ventilation systems, adequate lighting, and sanitary facilities that maintained basic human dignity. The transatlantic crossing in July 1943 provided the second phase of what would become a comprehensive culinary shock. Gefreiter Wilhelm Becker of the 21st Panzer Division meticulously kept a food diary that survived the war in letters smuggled to his family after repatriation. Breakfast: oatmeal with sugar and milk. White bread with butter, coffee with cream, he wrote on July 15. This was food reserved for officers in Germany, not common soldiers. Yet here, even we prisoners received it without question or restriction. The meals served aboard the transport ships amazed and bewildered the German prisoners. They discovered that American merchant sailors routinely consumed steak, fresh eggs, vegetables that had been properly preserved, and, incredibly, ice cream. Ice cream. In wartime Germany, this delicacy was a luxury reserved exclusively for the highest party officials and their families. The ship's refrigerated storage contained more calories than entire German combat units received in their theoretical daily rations. Lieutenant Heinrich Weber, whose Prussian military family had served Germany with distinction since the time of Frederick the Great, later wrote in his unpublished memoirs, "As our ship approached the American coast, I watched sailors casually disposing of barely touched meals, complete dinners going overboard as waste. I thought of my men back in Africa, grateful for a handful of dates and brackish water, and I began to understand that we had been fighting not just an enemy army, but an entire civilization that operated beyond our comprehension." August 2, 1943, Norfolk Naval Base, Virginia marked another crucial milestone. The first meal served on American soil shattered the last remaining vestiges of Nazi propaganda about American weakness and inefficiency. Upon their arrival in America, the comfort of the Pullman railroad cars that would carry them to their designated prison camps amazed the Germans, as did their first glimpse of the country's vast size and remarkably undamaged prosperity. But nothing in their experience had prepared them for the bounty that awaited them at the processing station. They were served a meal that defied not just their expectations, but their understanding of what was possible during wartime. Fried chicken, creamy mashed potatoes with rich gravy, green beans, cornbread, apple pie, and coffee sweetened with real sugar. Unteroffizier Johann Fischer, a baker's son from Munich with an intimate understanding of food costs and availability, carefully calculated in his diary that this single meal contained more actual meat than his entire family's monthly ration allowance in Germany. Most remarkably, the Americans apologized that the meal was simple, because the prisoners had arrived unexpectedly. They apologized for food that German generals would have considered an elaborate feast, Fischer wrote in amazement. That moment revealed to me the true depth of our delusion about American capabilities and resources. The train journey from Norfolk to the camps scattered across Texas and Oklahoma would prove more destructive to Nazi ideology than any military defeat could have achieved. As the trains rolled steadily through Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Arkansas, the prisoners pressed their faces against windows, witnessing an America that simply could not exist according to the Nazi doctrine they had been taught to accept without question. At every station stop, they observed American railroad workers consuming substantial meat sandwiches, drinking bottles of Coca-Cola, and smoking cigarettes without any apparent concern for rationing or shortages. At a stop in Memphis, Tennessee, prisoners watched in fascination as a dining car was loaded with fresh provisions for the journey ahead. Sides of beef, crates of fresh eggs, heavy sacks of potatoes, and boxes of vegetables were loaded with casual efficiency. The quantity loaded for this single train exceeded what entire German divisions had received in a month during their African campaign. Stabsgefreiter Rudolf Richter, an agricultural inspector from Westphalia before his military conscription, carefully documented what he observed during the journey. The amount of food transported daily on American railways could sustain all of Germany, he wrote in careful detail. I saw freight cars completely filled with wheat, refrigerated cars carrying fresh meat and milk, entire trains devoted exclusively to moving food from farms to cities. No military guards, no special protection required. Food moved with the constancy of flowing rivers. September 19, 1943, Camp Hearn, Texas. The arrival at the permanent prison camps provided the next level of cognitive demolition through the simple medium of food. The United States government had made a deliberate decision to make life as comfortable as possible for the prisoners for two strategic reasons: to ensure good treatment for American prisoners held by Germany, and to win the hearts and minds of German prisoners who would eventually return to help rebuild a post-war Europe. The mess halls in these camps exceeded anything most German soldiers had experienced even during peacetime before the war. Electric refrigerators hummed constantly, maintaining fresh food at proper temperatures. Automated dishwashers cleaned thousands of plates with mechanical efficiency. Steam tables kept prepared food warm for hours without spoilage. Industrial mixers kneaded dough for fresh bread daily. The prisoners were guaranteed by the Geneva Convention to receive food, clothing, and medical care equal to that provided to their captors' own forces. At Camp Swift, Texas, Unteroffizier Karl Hoffmann found himself assigned to kitchen duty, where what he discovered would haunt him for decades to come. Today we disposed of 300 pounds of food, he wrote on September 23rd with obvious distress. Not spoiled food, but excess from overcooking. The American regulations require preparing 10% more than actually needed to ensure every prisoner receives full portions. The surplus is simply removed and discarded. The daily ration scale posted prominently in the kitchen read like pure fantasy to men accustomed to wartime scarcity. 3/4 pound of meat per prisoner per day, 1 full pound of potatoes, 1/2 pound of vegetables, 3/4 pound of bread, plus sugar, coffee, milk, butter, and fresh eggs. The cost of feeding prisoners was carefully managed by the government, with farmers who employed prisoner labor paying 45 cents per hour per laborer to help offset the millions of dollars needed for the entire prisoner program. Feldwebel Hans Klein, now settled at Camp McCain in Mississippi, wrote detailed descriptions to his family. For breakfast, we receive oatmeal or corn flakes with milk and sugar, scrambled eggs, bacon, toast with butter and jam, and coffee with cream. For lunch, meat, always meat, with vegetables, potatoes or rice, bread, and a dessert. For dinner, more meat, more vegetables, soup, bread, and coffee. On Sundays, we receive chicken or turkey with all the traditional accompaniments. The prisoners gradually discovered that American military rations far exceeded what German civilians had received even before the war began. German civilian rations had dropped to a mere 2,078 calories by 1942-43, then further declined to just 1,981 calories in 1943-44. Meanwhile, German prisoners in American camps were receiving over 3,000 calories daily, more food than they had consumed as free men in peacetime Germany. At Camp Clinton, Mississippi, which housed the highest-ranking German officers, including 25 generals, the food situation reached levels that bordered on the surreal. General von Arnim, Rommel's replacement in North Africa, lived in a private house and was provided with a car and driver. The captured generals maintained their own cooks and could request special meals prepared to their specifications. They dined regularly on steaks, roasted chickens, fresh fish, and vegetables that had not been available to German civilians since 1940. But even the enlisted men's rations stunned the ordinary prisoners with their abundance. Obergefreiter Franz Müller wrote from Camp Shelby with obvious amazement. Today for lunch we had fried catfish caught fresh from Mississippi rivers, served with coleslaw, hush puppies, a type of fried cornbread, green beans, and peach cobbler for dessert. The soldiers who serve us eat exactly the same food. In Germany, we were repeatedly told that Americans starved their population. another propaganda fabrication completely exposed. By October 1943, German prisoners were working on American farms throughout the region, and what they witnessed there completed the total destruction of Nazi agricultural mythology that had formed a cornerstone of their ideological indoctrination. From 1943, when the prisoners began arriving in large numbers, until the end of the war in 1945, the prisoners in Texas picked peaches and citrus fruits, harvested rice, cut timber, baled hay, threshed grain, and gathered pecans alongside American workers. At a dairy farm outside Huntsville, Texas, Unteroffizier Ernst Wagner watched in complete disbelief as the farmer calmly dumped hundreds of gallons of fresh milk because the processing plant could not handle the day's surplus production. He poured it directly onto the ground without any concern or regret, Wagner wrote with obvious distress. Milk that German mothers would have begged for their starving children was being used to irrigate pastures. When Wagner protested this apparent waste, the farmer patiently explained that there was simply excess production, and that flooding the market would collapse prices and harm all dairy farmers. Approximately 12,000 prisoners of war were held in camps throughout Nebraska, where they worked alongside local farms, stacking hay and laboring in the sugar beet fields that stretched to the horizon. Gefreiter Paul Schmidt, assigned to work on a corn farm, wrote with continuing amazement, "The farmers' chickens eat grain without any restriction whatsoever. The farm cats receive fresh milk daily as if it were water. The dogs receive meat scraps that would sustain a German family for several days. The American farmers who employed prisoner labor often invited the Germans to share meals with their families. This practice violated no regulations as long as guards remained present during the meals. These intimate dining experiences in American farm kitchens delivered perhaps the most devastating psychological impact of all. Farmers who contracted for prisoner workers usually provided meals for their laborers, and these spreads were simply overwhelming to men accustomed to military rations and wartime shortages. Tables groaned under platters of fried chicken, enormous bowls of mashed potatoes swimming in butter, green beans slow-cooked with ham, fresh corn on the cob dripping with melted butter, biscuits served with sausage gravy, multiple varieties of homemade pie, and pitchers of cold milk alongside endless coffee. These meals represented abundance that transcended anything in the prisoner's previous experience. Christmas 1943 delivered a psychological impact from which many prisoners would never fully recover. At Camp Hearn, Texas, the Christmas dinner menu read like an impossible dream crafted by a starving man's imagination. The feast included roast turkey with stuffing, honey-glazed ham, mashed potatoes with giblet gravy, candied sweet potatoes, fresh green beans, corn, cranberry sauce, fresh baked rolls with butter, mince pie, pumpkin pie, apple pie served with ice cream, coffee milk, and apple cider. Feldwebel Hans Klein wrote from Camp McCain with obvious emotional distress, "We ate until we became physically ill. Not from spoiled or bad food, but from the overwhelming quantity of rich food. Our stomachs, conditioned by years of inadequate rations, simply could not process such enormous amounts. Men were openly weeping while eating, remembering their hungry families at home who would never see such abundance." The contrast with German prisoner rations was stark and undeniable. German prisoners in German camps received 9 pounds of potatoes per week, augmented by 5 pounds of bread and 2.5 pounds of cabbage, with small amounts of margarine and ersatz coffee made from ground acorns. Meanwhile, German prisoners in America were experiencing nutrition levels unknown since peacetime, consuming food that exceeded their pre-war civilian diets. As spring arrived in March 1944, the food situation in American camps became even more remarkable. Fresh vegetables appeared daily on prison tables: crisp lettuce, ripe tomatoes, cucumbers, radishes, carrots, celery. Fruits that had been unimaginable luxuries in wartime Germany became routine: oranges, grapefruit, bananas, and strawberries during their proper season. The variety alone overwhelmed men who had become accustomed to monotonous military fare or the improvised meals of the African desert. The camp bakeries operated like small industrial facilities, producing fresh bread daily in varieties that reflected American abundance. white bread, whole wheat, rye, whatever the bakers chose to prepare. Prisoners who worked in these bakeries reported using more flour in a single day than German bakeries had received in an entire month during wartime rationing. Unteroffizier Johann Fischer, the baker's son from Munich, found himself assigned to the Camp Swift bakery where he witnessed production levels that defied his understanding of wartime economics. "We bake 500 loaves daily for our compound alone," he wrote to his family. "We make pastries, cakes, and cookies for special occasions. The sugar we use for one day's desserts would have supplied a German bakery for several months during the war." The summer of 1944 brought news that would further challenge the prisoners' understanding of their situation. The invasion of Normandy on June 6 meant that Germany was now fighting desperately on three fronts: against the Soviets in the east, against the Western Allies in France, and continuing the struggle in Italy. Yet the food situation in American prisoner camps remained not only unchanged but actually improved as more prisoners were assigned to agricultural work and witnessed firsthand the incredible source of American prosperity. In Nebraska, prisoners working in the sugar beet fields made a startling discovery. American farmers in a single county produced more sugar beets than several German provinces combined. At a canning factory in Arkansas, prisoners observed with growing amazement as tons of perfectly edible peaches were rejected and discarded for minor cosmetic blemishes that would never affect their taste or nutritional value. Meanwhile, at Fort Lewis in Washington state, a different group of German prisoners was experiencing similar revelations about American abundance. Among them was 18-year-old Gefreiter Gunter Grau, who had arrived in August 1944 after being captured during the Normandy fighting. Standing in front of the camp canteen in late summer 1944, considering what luxury to purchase first, an ice cream or a bottle of Coca-Cola, he would later write, "The last ice cream I had been able to buy in Germany was years before the war, but Coca-Cola I had never tasted before in my life, so I decided to treat myself to both." The moment of realization struck him with sudden force. "I suddenly realized how extremely lucky I had been to be captured by the American army and not the Russian one." By September 1944, after more than a year in American captivity, many German prisoners had gained between 20 and 30 pounds. Medical examinations conducted by both American and German doctors showed improved health across all measurable metrics: better teeth from regular milk consumption, stronger bones from adequate protein intake, clearer skin from vitamins found in fresh vegetables and fruits. Dr. Friedrich Bauer, a German medical officer imprisoned at Camp Shelby, Mississippi, carefully documented this remarkable health transformation. The men who arrived as prisoners were severely malnourished, with many suffering from scurvy, pellagra, and other diseases caused by vitamin deficiencies, Dr. Bauer wrote in his official reports. After one full year of American prison rations, they are healthier than they have ever been in their lives. Their physical transformation is truly remarkable to observe, but the psychological impact penetrated even deeper than the physical improvements. Gefreiter Wilhelm Becker wrote with brutal honesty, "We no longer speak seriously of German victory. How can we possibly defeat a nation that feeds its prisoners this abundantly while simultaneously waging war on multiple fronts across the globe? This level of available resources reveals an advantage that appears completely insurmountable." December 1944 brought news of the Battle of the Bulge, Germany's last desperate major offensive in the West. Yet, in American prisoner camps, the Christmas dinner of 1944 exceeded even the previous year's incredible feast. Turkey, ham, roast beef, and all the traditional accompaniments were joined by special treats: fruitcakes shipped from American commercial bakeries, candy canes, chocolate, real chocolate, not the ersatz variety made from turnips that had become standard in Germany, nuts, and an abundance of fresh fruit. At Camp Clinton, Mississippi, Italian prisoners who had changed sides after Italy's surrender in 1943 were permitted to help prepare special pasta dishes for the Christmas celebration. The German prisoners watched as their former allies, now cooperating fully with their American captors, prepared elaborate meals using ingredients that had vanished from German tables years earlier: olive oil, real cheese, and white flour of a quality that had not been seen in Germany since before the war. May 8, 1945, Victory in Europe Day. The war had finally ended, But the food revelations continued to challenge everything the German prisoners thought they understood about their enemies. The prisoners learned that throughout the entire duration of the war, American civilians had never faced truly serious food rationing. Meat had been somewhat limited, and sugar and coffee had been restricted, but Americans had never experienced genuine hunger or malnutrition on any significant scale. The strategic depth and productive capacity of American agriculture had never been seriously threatened or disrupted by the war. Even with millions of men serving overseas and much of the nation's industrial capacity devoted to war production, the agricultural system had continued to produce abundance that seemed almost limitless to European eyes. In May 1945, responding to civilian complaints, the Office of the Provost Marshal General imposed some limitations on available food and ended canteen food sales because American civilians had begun complaining that the prisoners were eating too well. Even with these deliberately reduced rations, German prisoners continued to receive substantially more food than German civilians would see for many years after the war's end. When the statistics were finally compiled after the war, they revealed an undeniable truth that would reshape understanding of national power and resources. German prisoners in America consumed an average of 3,200 calories per day throughout their captivity. German soldiers in active combat had theoretically received 3,600 calories daily when supplies actually reached them, which became increasingly rare as the war progressed. German civilians by 1945 were surviving on fewer than 1,412 calories daily, barely sufficient to sustain life. American prison camps served approximately 3/4 of a pound of meat per prisoner daily. German weekly military rations had included 120 grams of sausage or tinned fish when supplies were available. The mathematical contrast between American plenty and German scarcity had become the most powerful argument against Nazi ideology, delivered not through words or propaganda, but through daily personal experience that could not be denied or explained away. During the summer of 1945, as German prisoners prepared for eventual repatriation to their devastated homeland, many desperately begged to remain in America permanently. They had witnessed an agricultural and industrial system that completely transformed their understanding of what human societies could achieve. Hans Wecker, a prisoner at Fort Robinson, Nebraska, later recalled, "Life in the camps represented a vast improvement for many of us who had grown up in cold water flats in Germany's cities. We discovered running water, central heating, and abundant food as daily realities. Our treatment was excellent in every measurable way. The re-education programs that had been designed to transform Nazi thinking achieved their greatest success through meals rather than lectures or political discussions. Each day, German prisoners confronted physical evidence that systematically contradicted Nazi teachings about American weakness, racial inferiority, and democratic inefficiency. Every satisfied appetite directly challenged their former beliefs about Aryan racial superiority and the supposed chaos of democratic systems." Dr. Walter Schreiber, a former Wehrmacht colonel and trained agricultural economist, calculated after the war with devastating precision, "The food that America casually provided to German prisoners could have sustained the entire German Sixth Army throughout the siege of Stalingrad. Their agricultural surplus alone would have adequately fed all of Nazi-occupied Europe. We never understood that we were fighting a nation that had essentially solved the fundamental problem of human existence, how to feed everyone adequately. Between 1945 and 1946, a total of 371,683 German prisoners were systematically repatriated from American camps back to their homeland. They returned to a Germany that was destroyed, divided among the victorious powers, and facing widespread starvation. But they brought with them invaluable knowledge that prosperity was actually achievable, that a society could successfully nourish all its citizens, and that democratic systems could produce genuine abundance rather than the chaos that Nazi propaganda had promised would result from democratic governance. Many former prisoners became influential leaders in West Germany's remarkable agricultural revolution during the post-war Reconstruction period. Hans Müller, who had been imprisoned at Camp Shelby, introduced American farming methods to Bavaria, successfully increasing crop yields by 40% within just 5 years. Wilhelm Fischer, formerly of Camp McCain, helped establish food distribution networks based on American models he had observed. Dr. Friedrich Bauer advocated for nutritional standards based on what he had witnessed in American prison camps. After repatriation, approximately 5,000 Germans eventually immigrated permanently to the United States, and thousands more would have come if immigration quotas had permitted. They sought not merely economic opportunity, but the food security and abundance they had discovered and experienced as prisoners of war. In October 1947, at Fort Lewis, Washington, Gefreiter Gunter Grau was among the very last German prisoners to be repatriated after 3 full years in American captivity. Decades later, he would return to America as a successful businessman, but he never forgot that pivotal moment at the camp canteen when he could casually choose between ice cream and Coca-Cola, luxuries that his family in devastated Germany could only dream about. We were always treated with complete fairness, received sufficient food, and earned 80 cents per day that gave us the opportunity to buy cigarettes, chocolate, ice cream, and Coca-Cola, he would write 73 years later in a letter of gratitude. These were things that my mother and sister in Germany could only dream of having. In 1985, Austin, Texas hosted the 40th anniversary reunion of German prisoners of war, with over 500 former prisoners returning to America, many bringing their families to show them where their personal transformation had begun. Former Unteroffizier Karl Hoffmann, now 78 years old and an American citizen since 1955, delivered a speech that captured the essence of their collective experience. We came to America as dedicated warriors of the Third Reich, absolutely convinced of our racial superiority and certain that American democracy represented weakness and inefficiency, Hoffmann told the assembled crowd. We departed as witnesses to a profound truth that changed our understanding of the world. America's true strength came from agricultural productivity and industrial capacity, not from racial purity or military conquest. Every single meal served in those prison camps systematically challenged our deeply held beliefs. He continued with obvious emotion. The Americans fed us, their enemies, substantially better than Hitler had ever fed us, his supposedly valued soldiers. They possessed such surplus production that routine waste was simply accepted reality. This was not intended as mockery or psychological torture, but represented simple daily reality. We learned that a nation capable of feeding its enemies without strain or hardship has achieved a form of victory that transcends military conquest. A society with such abundant resources has accomplished what the Third Reich never could, the complete defeat of scarcity itself. We returned to Germany knowing that our entire worldview had been built on systematic deception and lies. The Americans had prevailed through agricultural superiority and industrial capacity that we had never imagined possible. We who had marched across Europe as conquerors had been fundamentally transformed by witnessing abundance that exceeded our imagination. Hoffmann concluded his address with words that brought the entire auditorium to sustained applause. To America, from your former enemies, thank you for demonstrating that true strength comes from creation rather than destruction. You fed us when we would have starved you, and that generosity and victory defines what genuine power actually means. The auditorium erupted in sustained applause as Americans and Germans stood together, former enemies now united in recognition of a transformation that had begun with something as simple as a well-prepared meal in June 1943. The story of German prisoners and American food demonstrates how profound personal change can occur through direct experience rather than through argument or propaganda. The German soldiers who witnessed American agricultural capacity firsthand became living testimony to democracy's practical success and effectiveness. Their transformation began not with political lectures or ideological re-education programs, but with daily meals that spoke more powerfully than any words could have achieved. Each carefully prepared meal challenged Nazi ideology more effectively than any formal education program could have accomplished. The transformation proved so complete and lasting that when former prisoner Gunter Grau returned to Fort Lewis in 2017 at age 91, he rode a bicycle across the base wearing signs that read, USA, the country and its people, you are my first and final love. It was in August 1944 when I first came here as a prisoner of war, he told gathered reporters and officials. We were always treated with fairness. received sufficient food, and earned money that gave us the opportunity to buy cigarettes, chocolate, ice cream, and Coca-Cola, things that my mother and sister in Germany could only dream of possessing. That is why I have returned here 73 years later to say simply, thank you, America. I will never forget what you did for us. Colonel William Parsons, Deputy Garrison Commander of Joint Base Lewis McChord, greeted him with words that captured the enduring significance of the prisoner experience. You remind us that how we treat people defines who we are as a nation and as human beings. There are times even today when we might want to forget that fundamental lesson, and you ensure that such wisdom is never forgotten. The German prisoners experienced American agricultural capacity and industrial strength, and they were profoundly changed by that experience. They had arrived as dedicated enemies, departed as witnesses to democratic achievement, and many eventually returned as immigrants and friends. Their children would mature in a democratic Germany firmly allied with the United States, representing a partnership built on understanding gained through unexpected generosity during humanity's darkest hour. The prison camps themselves left minimal physical traces after the war ended. Most were systematically dismantled, their buildings sold or demolished, their land returned to agricultural use or converted to other purposes. But their impact endured in the memories and experiences of those who lived through them, and in the democratic reconstruction of Germany that followed in the post-war years. The Marshall Plan, which would feed and rebuild all of Europe, extended the lesson learned in prisoner camps that generosity and victory creates the foundation for lasting peace. Former prisoners who achieved success in post-war Germany often credited their American camp experience as fundamentally transformative to their understanding of how societies could function. They had witnessed prosperity achieved through cooperation rather than conquest, observed different races working together productively, and seen democratic systems producing genuine wealth rather than the chaos that Nazi propaganda had promised would result from democratic governance. These lessons, absorbed through daily experience rather than theoretical instruction, proved more powerful and lasting than any formal political education could have achieved. Dr. Arnold Kramer, the leading historian of German prisoners in America, concluded, America won the propaganda war not through clever messages or sophisticated techniques, but through sheer undeniable reality. Every meal served, every electric light that functioned reliably, every working toilet was a concrete argument against Nazism that could not be refuted. The prisoners were converted by prosperity they could see, touch, and taste daily. The numbers tell only part of this remarkable story. Yes, 371,683 German prisoners were held in American camps throughout the war. Yes, they contributed 14 million man-days of essential agricultural labor to the American war effort. Yes, fewer than 1% ever attempted escape from captivity. But the real significance lies in the human transformation achieved through the simple act of eating well while being treated with fundamental dignity and respect. When modern historians examine post-war German democracy's remarkable success, they often point to the Marshall Plan, denazification programs, or the threat posed by Soviet communism. But they sometimes overlook the influence of 370,000 German soldiers who returned home having experienced American democracy as daily sustenance, fair treatment despite being enemies, and resources shared rather than hoarded for a privileged elite. These men became democracy's most effective ambassadors, each one influencing family members, friends, and entire communities through their personal experience and testimony. They had lived within the supposed enemy's system and found it superior in every measurable way to what they had known. This undeniable reality discredited Nazi ideology more effectively than any propaganda campaign or re-education program could have achieved. When the last German prisoner departed American shores in 1946, they left behind a remarkable historical record, the lowest escape rate of any major prisoner population in modern history, the highest rate of voluntary cooperation with camp authorities, and the most successful transformation of enemy combatants into future allies ever documented. All of this was achieved not through harsh treatment, intensive propaganda, or psychological manipulation, but through simple humanity and abundant, well-prepared food. The investment America made in feeding its prisoners through agricultural resources, logistical effort, and simple human decency yielded immeasurable returns for generations to come. Hundreds of thousands of Germans returned home having experienced democracy firsthand, understanding that American strength derived from productive capacity rather than racial ideology, and recognizing Nazi propaganda as complete fabrication designed to maintain power through deception. In the end, the German prisoners' experience in America proved that genuine power lies in the ability to create and share abundance rather than to hoard resources or dominate others. The fact that America could feed its enemies substantially better than Germany could feed its own soldiers revealed fundamental truths about competing political and economic systems that no amount of propaganda could overcome or explain away. The German prisoners had arrived in America expecting to find weakness, division, and the chaos that Nazi propaganda had promised would characterize democratic societies. Instead, they discovered agricultural and industrial capacity of seemingly unlimited scope, combined with a humanity and fairness that contradicted everything they had been taught about their enemies. They came as prisoners but departed as witnesses to democratic achievement and human possibility. In their personal transformation lay the seeds of the Atlantic Alliance, the Marshall Plan, and the rebuilt democratic Germany that would emerge from the war's devastation. They had experienced American abundance and would never forget its lessons. Their children and grandchildren would grow up in a prosperous, democratic Germany, allied with the United States, members of NATO, and citizens of the European Union. This remarkable transformation could be traced in part to that pivotal moment when hungry Afrika Corps soldiers consumed their first American meal and began to recognize that their entire worldview had been built on systematic lies. Food had influenced the war's ultimate outcome as decisively as any weapon system or military strategy. Carefully prepared meals had won hearts and minds as completely as any battlefield victory, and in that unexpected triumph lay the foundation for